Just double checking. Does everyone see my slide?
Yep.
Great.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Great.
And we are live.
And just checking, will we be able to see that people are joining?
Yes, we have 6 people who've already joined. You can see those if you click on participate.
Great. For those of you already joined, we're going to take a few minutes to let everybody log on, and here's some instructions for you if you decide to join by phone instead, or just hang in there and we'll be with you shortly. I'm going to repeat again for those of you who have already joined. We will be starting the meeting shortly after 7, and we're waiting for the remainder of the participants to join. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk with you shortly. Welcome. For those of you who are already joined, we're going to wait a few more minutes for other attendees to join, and we'll be with you shortly. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Just wanted to let you know that the meeting will now be recorded and posted online. We're all really excited to be here tonight to provide an overview of the Rancho Cañada Floodplain Restoration Project. It's proposed for the Rancho Cañada unit of the Palo Corona Regional Park. We have several speakers tonight who will contribute to the presentation. I'm Laura Moran. I'm the Bay Area Director and Principal Restoration Ecologist for SWCA Environmental Consulting. We're a nationwide consulting firm focused on environmental planning, ecological restoration, regulatory compliance, and natural and cultural resources services. We are teamed with Mcbain Associates, who is the lead consultant for this project, and I will introduce each of these speakers. So in addition to me from SWCA, we have Mark Brandy, who's a senior restoration ecologist and landscape architect. He will also be speaking about some of the recreation and landscape design opportunities for the project. Meg Perry from SWCA is our lead facilitator and will lead the Q&A portion of our presentation. Rafael Peon from the Park District will be providing an introduction to the project, which is taking place on the park's Rancho Cañada unit of the Palo Corona Regional Park. Tom Gandesberry from the State Coastal Conservancy, a state agency established to protect and improve natural lands and waterways along California's coast, and has provided a large amount of funding for this project. Katrina Harrison, the project manager for Mcbain Associates, a consulting firm with over 25 years of experience in restoring river ecosystem functions across the Western US. Other team members will also be available to field questions during the Q&A. Tonight, we're using a Zoom webinar format, which means that audio and video will be disabled for attendees during the presentation. The presentation will be followed by an interactive question and comment session. You'll have the opportunity to participate by raising your hand and then unmuting yourself in Zoom. After this meeting, please feel free to visit the project website for more information and updates as we move forward with the planning and design process. Also, you will see the closed captioning start to show up at the bottom of your screen. If you find this distracting, you can click on the CC and it will stop showing up on your screen. So feel free to do that as well. Here's our proposed agenda. We have a pretty quick agenda that lasts about 25 minutes so that we can leave ample time for Q&A. I'm providing the welcome. Hello. The project introduction will be provided by Rafael. Overview and history of the project will be from Tom. Restoration design by Katrina. Access and revegetation by Mark Brandy. And then questions and comments by Meg Perry. So with that, I will turn it over to Rafael. And again, welcome. We're happy to have you here.
Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us on this monumental project. We have a great array of folks here who are going to be presenting. And again, we look forward to being in contact with you as the project moves forward. A little bit of history. Back in the 1970s, the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District was a vision that several citizens and not-for-profit organizations and other parties dreamed of. They thought that it was very important to set aside open spaces and protect them, not only for habitat, but for public access, and to perform science research also on these properties. The coalition was soon formed, and that coalition consisted of citizens, not-for-profit organizations, and the state of California. And in 1971, the coalition was successful in working with the county of creating a ballot measure and placing a ballot measure for the 1972 election. In 1972, the voters of Monterey County overwhelmingly approved the creation of the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District. And we've been humming along since then. In fact, this year marks our 50th year anniversary. So again, thank you for making this possible. Since 1972, we've created over 24 parks, open spaces, and trails. Today, half of those are operated under lease by other jurisdictions or have been conveyed to other jurisdictions, or, and half of those that remain are operated by the Park District. Now, about a dozen years ago or so, the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District acquired the Palo Corona Ranch. And in the acquisition of this 5,000 acre parcel and ranch, our goal was to create habitat, protect habitat, restore habitat, but also to provide world-class open space recreation and scientific research. This 5,000 acre ranch spans pretty much from the Carmel River all the way south to Garapata State Park. So it follows Highway 1, parallels Highway 1 for 10 miles. Today, we'd like to thank those people who made that property part of our agency. And again, the Fish family was instrumental along with several other parties in helping us acquire that. Most recently, we acquired the Rancho Golf Course or Golf Club. And in 2017, that parcel, that golf course, which had been enjoyed by the community, became part of the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District's park. And as was mentioned earlier, it's now considered the Rancho Cañada unit of Palo Corona Regional Park. We'd especially like to thank the parties that made this acquisition possible. The Santa Lucia Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, of course, the owners who were really very generous and helpful, the Trust for Public Land, and again, the state of California. Now, a few months back, we completed the park's general development plan. And part of that was to determine what purposes, what functions would be best for this property. We had several public hearings that were extremely well received by the public and in their support, several target projects were identified. Namely, the public said, first and foremost, we really want you to restore this golf course into native habitat. We want to make sure that the preservation of this property is long-term, and it speaks to the science that other groups like the Big Sur Land Trust and others are working on the Carmel River Free Project. So again, number one, let's restore this golf course, this former golf course, or a substantial portion of it, back into native habitat. The other aspect is, let's see what we can do to enhance access to Palo Corona Regional Park. The former golf club had a sizable golf footprint on the golf course, parking lot, and other structures. And these other structures, these extant buildings and facilities were going to be repurposed and have been repurposed for public benefit. Today, we still hold public sessions, meetings, and private events at the clubhouse. We also have been working on the restoration of this project. And again, Mr. Gandesberry will be talking to that in a few minutes. We adaptively reused the former clubhouse pro shop into a discovery center. Inside this discovery center, what we're hoping to do is showcase all of the science that all the organizations in this part of California are working on to restore habitat, preserve cultural heritage, and to perform science as we go forward to determine what changes climate and other factors may be posing on this habitat. We adapted the old golf cart barn into our maintenance complex, And the old offices soon became our agency's headquarters. Now, some people have said, well, in the past, you must have consumed a lot of water. Well, quite a bit of water was consumed to irrigate the golf course. The vast majority has now been retired, and a little bit more information will be provided on that later on, has been retired, allowing that water to remain in the aquifer and the Carmel River. And this is part of the Carmel River's restoration effort. What I'd like to do next is introduce you to Mr. Tom Gandesberry. He's going to be providing us an oversight on this, an overview of the project. And again, we would be glad to answer any questions that you have thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Good evening, Tom Gandesberry again, and I'm with the State Coastal Conservancy in Oakland. We're an independent natural resource agency, primarily grant-making organization, and we're part of the state of California government. I want to start out by recognizing a unique partnership that we have in the Carmel River watershed. It really is unique in California. It's around, and the focal point is around a fish, the steelhead, closely related to salmon, acts just like a salmon, lives in the ocean, goes up into the creeks to spawn. There grew a very strong partnership around this fish and around the habitat it needs. Trout Unlimited, excuse me, Trust for Public Land, Carmel River Steelhead Association, Carmel River Conservancy, and the Santa Lucia Conservancy, as well as the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District and Water Management District, excuse me. And that partnership, the point here is that pulling together as organizations and as individuals, we can accomplish a lot more than we can individually. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of science behind what is being proposed. Rivers have been studied for decades and decades by academics, by federal and state scientists. And so we have some models and some templates to work from. Many of the restoration projects that have been successfully constructed on the West Coast, and there tend to be a lot more in the north because there are more rivers, there's more water, so there's more to work with in the north. They tend to focus on one aspect or function of the river that's lacking. And what we've learned over the decades too is that we make physical changes first. And we know that the native plants and animals will come in later if the physics are right. But we are taking a holistic approach. We're not just doing this project simply for one fish, but a whole bunch of things happen when you do that. The salmon, I'll keep calling salmon steelhead, they need two things. They need spawning areas and they need rearing habitat and refuge. Those can be in the same place, but often they're not. On big rivers like this, big waterways, the rearing habitat, this is where they need to hang out and grow and become big enough to swim out to the sea. That naturally happens lower in the watershed. And that is the unique thing that floodplains provide. Floodplains also, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but they provide a wide variety of ecosystem benefits. So it's not just for the fish we're doing this, it's for an entire food web. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. Coastal rivers in California have been altered by humans, and a lot of damage has been done to the habitats for fish and wildlife. In the north, it was mostly logging and mining. And then just about every river in California has been altered by agriculture. This is because farmers love the rich alluvial soils that you find in the floodplains. And we also had some gravel mining on this river. So in general, rivers have been straightened out and cut off from their floodplains. The question is, of course, can this be reversed? And the answer is, well, unfortunately, in most places, it's not feasible. And next slide, please. We have some really excellent historic information here. And this is from this first image on the left is 1876. The federal government came along and did an amazing survey of California coast. And in that red box in the upper right-hand side is your Crossroads Shopping Center. We can see that there was a river wetland area up there, a riparian area. We're certainly not going to be taking the Crossroads Shopping Center back to its natural state, that area. And likewise, in most parts of California, unfortunately, downtown Santa Cruz and the San Lorenzo River, the San Jose Guadalupe River. Here in Oakland, the creeks are all in pipes under the streets, so it's usually not feasible in most of California. But here we have a sizable piece of land that's relatively undeveloped. Yes, it was a farm and then it was a golf course, but and I also wanted to mention, Raphael mentioned the Big Sur Land Trust, not to just to stave off any confusion. The Big Sur Land Trust and the county are working on a similar project just downstream, adjacent to Highway 1, the former Odello farm, called the Carmel River Free Project, stands for Floodplain Restoration and Environmental Enhancement. That one's going to be about 90 acres of floodplain, and we won't be talking about that tonight, but that's a companion project, a sort of a cousin of what we're doing here. Next slide, please. We're going to look at some images that were done. These are overlays of historic air photos. 1939. This is green areas are the riparian zone from a 1939 air photo that was flown, probably in connection to World War II. And then the next slide, please. 1974. The next one. You can see how much of the riparian area was lost, and that's going to be a dense forest and floodplain. So we're striving to bring some of that back to the Rancho Cañada unit. But we, as you can see in this air photo, a lot of homes there. We have to be mindful that we're also working with humans. We are not trying to take the property back to where it was in 1770. We have to work with the developed areas, with our neighbors up and downstream. We have bridges, we have pipes, we have an active park to work within, and we have the recreational needs and the connection to Palo Corona that Raphael mentioned. But what makes the Carmel River watershed unique is that the spawning areas are largely intact. There are a lot of structures such as dams and road crossings that were blocking fish passage spawning to the spawning areas, but they've been tackled. And most notably, the San Clemente Dam was taken down and removed in 2015. And now we're working on a lot of the smaller structures on some of the important tributaries. So the good news is that we're on track to address all of the barriers by 2025, all the major barriers, with the exception of the Los Padres Dam, which is, as you probably know, a key bit of your water infrastructure. And this will open up over 100 miles of spawning areas for the steelhead. So that brings us to the second thing that we need. We need the refuge, the nursery area for these fish in the lower part of the river. And that brings us to Rancho Cañada. And some of the changes made more recently in this, and somewhat visible in this image, is that to protect the golf course, rock armor was placed along the river. We call it riprap. And a lot of that was put in after the big flood events in 1995 and 1998. Raphael also mentioned sort of the recent history on this property. You know, it was a golf course, and when the lease ran out, the Trust for Public Land stepped in and purchased several of the parcels with an investment by state resource agencies, including my own. And that property was then transferred to the Regional Park District. And the purpose of that acquisition, again, was to conserve the land, to restore the floodplain, and to retire the water that was used to irrigate the golf course, thereby, leaving most of the water back in the river. And then to bring this full circle into today, in 2018, the Conservancy partnered with the Park District and Trout Unlimited to move the floodplain project along. Here we are almost, 2016, a few years ago. First, a technical advisory committee was formed of federal, state, and local agency experts to advise on the project. And it was this group of river scientists that came up with the vision, the goals, and the objectives for this project, which led to a conceptual design. And that is the concept that we want to present to you tonight. So then I will now hand it over to Katrina Harrison from Mcbain Associates. Mcbain is a consulting firm specializing in river restoration, and Katrina is our lead design engineer and project manager. Take it away, Katrina.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction, and welcome to everyone. Very excited to talk to you about this exciting project tonight. As I will share in more detail in the coming slides, we do anticipate the project having a variety of benefits for the environment as well as for people. We anticipate it to provide habitat for steelhead, to increase vegetation along the river, which also provides habitat for birds, provide potential off-channel ponds for frogs, increase groundwater recharge, have upstream flood benefits, will be minimizing any removal of existing mature trees. And then also we anticipate expanded nature interaction areas and the ability for educational opportunities for the public to interact more closely with the Carmel River and watch the restoration as plants grow and the river changes over time. Next slide. So as Tom mentioned and showed you from the 1939 aerial to the 1974 to the 2016, there's been a reduction in the riparian forest along the Carmel River over the course of the last 100 years. One of the first things that we did as we moved out onto the site, and I got this contract with the Coastal Conservancy to move forward with the design, is we mapped the existing riparian vegetation. So what you see here is that existing vegetation map. The major areas that you'll see here, the river, which is in blue, and then there's also a large amount of orange areas around the river. Those areas are black cottonwoods. So some of those are some very mature black cottonwoods. And as we move forward with the design, we really focused on minimizing the impacts to those mature trees. Yep. Next slide. So to talk a little bit more about this, I'll explain this slide. So Tom mentioned both riparian and floodplain, and many of you I'm sure are very familiar with these terms. Others maybe not as much. So I'll try to define them briefly in this slide. So on the left-hand side of the photo, that's an example of what the Carmel River is like now, approximately. We have a high floodplain terrace, and then we have a deep incised channel. So what that means is we have a bunch of this old mature riparian trees, cottonwoods up on the top, but we can't recruit new trees because the new tree roots are too far away from the groundwater levels. So in order to obtain additional vegetation and recruitment of cottonwoods and willows along the channel, what we're hoping to do in the project is move more to something that you see on the right-hand side of this image and create floodplains, reconnect that floodplain to the river channel. So the floodplain would be the area that's relatively low next to the channel that gets inundated at higher flows. And the riparian areas or the riparian habitat would be the area along the river, vegetation, native vegetation that is planted near the river. One thing that I will just note is when we did our mapping on site, there was only 7 young cottonwoods that we found in the entire site. And that was on one low floodplain terrace near the river. So we're really restricting our ability to grow future forests unless we think about reconnecting the river to its floodplain for the future. Next slide. So then as these flows move up, this example photo shows you, or not photo, but concept, shows you what happens as fish move out onto those floodplain surfaces. So in addition to floodplains providing great habitat for recruiting cottonwoods and willows and great trees that we all enjoy the shade of, they also provide nursery habitat, as Tom was talking about, for the juvenile steelhead. So these steelhead can move out onto those floodplains. That provides places for them to rest when they're moving downstream in flood flows. We would call that low velocity refuge. It also provides opportunities in the wintertime for them to grow and get food. So we've got a lot of things happening when the water gets out on those floodplain surfaces. We're recruiting a lot more food to the system, encouraging the food web, which provides benefits for the juvenile steelhead, as well as for the whole ecosystem, the birds and the frogs and a variety of the other species and plants and animals that would use this area. Next slide. So this slide shows the natural channel movement over approximately 50 years. So each line is the current Carmel River center line and then future modeled center lines over time. So this does not represent what the river will absolutely do, but what it does help us do is anticipate where we would have erosion, where the river sort of wants to move in the future, and then we can consider that as we move forward with our design and make sure that we leave enough room for the river so that it can grow and migrate over time and move over time, which creates a diversity and a complexity of habitat. The current river channel will want to erode and move regardless of our project. And so as Tom was talking about in the past, in the 90s in particular, there was a lot of riprap that was added to the channel banks to try to slow down that movement. That also limits the extent of the habitat benefits. So as I'll talk about soon, that is one of the things that we're hoping to do. The proposed restoration project will also increase the area where the water can go during floods, which spreads it out and slows it down, which also helps reduce the extent of erosion on the existing channel. So that would help neighboring landowners as well as to reduce the potential for maintenance for the park district. So what we've used this particular modeling tool for is to identify where infrastructure should go and should not go so that we avoid potential future maintenance issues, as well as allow the river to function better and create that diversity and complexity of habitat. So I'll pause on this slide and spend quite a bit of time here because this is our draft conceptual design. It's draft, as it says in large font on top. We'll be continuing to adjust and refine the design as we move forwards. So on the previous slide, I showed you our channel movement. That went into developing this purple dashed line that you see on this figure. So the purple dashed line is what we would consider a channel zone or our channel migration zone. It's the area that's reserved for the river. The Carmel River, as it floods and ebbs, can create floodplains and create habitat for a variety of different native plants and animals. As I mentioned on the last slide, and Tom also mentioned in his introduction, there was a lot of riprap that was added to the riverbanks in the 1990s. You can see on this figure these various red areas. Those red areas are places where we'd be working to remove some of that riprap, to unleash the river, let it do what it wants to do, and again, create habitat. Instead of confining it to a channel, we can provide room for the river. Now, the green and blue blobs on this image are different types of habitat that we'd be creating. We'd be creating slow areas called alcoves, side channels, which are just the same as the Carmel River main stem, except they would inundate it, they would flow at a much higher flow, as well as low and higher floodplain surfaces, which are the dark green and the light green areas. This diversity of habitat types will lead to benefits for fish, as well as frogs and birds, and the whole suite of native plants and animals that we're hoping to see out here. These surfaces will increase the floodplain connectivity and allow water to spread out in the landscape in those higher flows. The next part I wanted to chat about on here is that this project is consistent with all of the park goals that Raphael mentioned as part of the general development plan. So it's hoping to balance habitat, restoration, recreation, as well as public access. So outside of the Purple Channel area, there are potential recreational opportunities for greater natural topography. Soil that we excavate from the new floodplain areas could provide additional trails, lookouts, natural sound barriers, outdoor education, and potentially help remove invasive species by smothering. We've been working to coordinate with several other projects, including several of the folks that are on the phone tonight. I've talked to even as recently as today, to coordinate with some of those projects, and we'll continue to refine those areas to make sure that we are avoiding impacts to other existing projects. We've also provided space for a wildlife corridor from north of Carmel Valley Road. You can see that as the gap in the brown blobs where we're demonstrating on the screen now. The eastern, roughly 1,000 feet of the park, as well as the area around the river, is designated for a wildlife corridor. So that space would provide space for animals to pass from north of the road, go onto the park, and then hopefully make their way down into the area around the river. Mark Brandy later in the presentation will talk further about these recreational opportunities. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention on this slide is that we would also be building a new bridge as part of the project. The new bridge would cross the Carmel River towards the upstream end of the project near the mouse in the area that's currently closed to the public. So that would also provide an additional opportunity for people to stand on the bridge and look down at the newly created floodplain surfaces. Next slide. So this slide, it shows some of the results from our fisheries modeling. The blue, light blue, and white areas are the areas that would be wet at a flow of 2,000 cubic feet per second, or approximately an average annual flood. The darker blue represents deeper areas and the lighter areas are shallow areas. The red dots on both the top and the bottom are fish. So this model actually shows how the fish move and grow over time. So the top half of this is the existing condition. So you can see how all of the fish are limited to the existing Carmel River main stem. On the bottom portion of the slide, you can see the additional floodplain and side channel and all the different types of habitats we'd be creating. And you can see some of the red dots out in those areas. So these fish would be using these new side channels as well as the deeper areas of the floodplain. As I think Tom mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, this creates opportunities for these juvenile fish to rear and grow, make them a larger size before they migrate out to the ocean, which increases their survival and their ability to make it back as an adult. Again, these floodplain surfaces will provide both places for the fish to rest, so winter velocity refuge, as well as winter rearing habitat, as well as in the early spring. And again, while we did not model specific other species, this modeling is indicative of creating more habitat for a wide range of aquatic species in addition to the steelhead. Next. Expanded floodplains also increase the ability for the water to soak into the ground, recharging the aquifer that provides most of the Monterey Peninsula, or not most, a part of the Monterey Peninsula's water supply, while also providing ecosystem benefits. And then finally, as discussed earlier, the other thing I wanted to mention on this slide is that by lowering the floodplains, we also increase the area of riparian vegetation. Those young plant roots will be closer to the groundwater table if we're lowering the surface of the ground. That means that we're going to be able to create habitat similar to what we saw like in that 1939 aerial photo or some of the earlier photos. We're recreating a habitat that's similar to what was there in the past, but we're making it in a way that will consider the human uses of the site, avoiding human impacts, encouraging human interaction and recreation in this space. Next slide. So as I mentioned, one of the benefits that we expect to see with this project is some flood benefits for upstream of the project. As many of you know, upstream is the Hacienda Carmel community. So again, the top slide is the existing conditions at what we call a 100-year flood flow. So this is a flow that's higher than any that's actually been observed in the historical record. It's a flow of 23,000 cubic feet per second. It's very big. And then that's the existing conditions on the top. And then on the bottom would be the future conditions with our project. So what you can see on the bottom is that there is a much larger area that's very dark blue. Those are the new floodplain surfaces that we'd be creating. So we're providing space for this flood water to go. What that does is it creates decreased depth upstream. So we can see that there's more areas that are not blue towards the right of the figures. And what that does is limits impacts to Hacienda Carmel in very large floods. Next slide. So finally, again, summarizing what I went into in detail in the last few slides, we expect the project to increase habitat for juvenile steelhead. We expect it to increase vegetation along the river. We expect more habitats for birds as they're using these new trees. We expect more potential off-channel ponds, potentially help the red-legged frog. We anticipate further groundwater recharge. We expect upstream flood benefits. We'll be minimizing the removal of the existing mature trees, but also providing an opportunity for that riparian forest to grow into the future with new younger trees before all of the old ones die. We'll be expanding the opportunity for people to interact with the river, as well as increasing the educational opportunities for people to really connect with the Carmel River and view it as a great resource that it is for this area. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark Randy from SWCA, our teaming consultant partner in this project, who will talk to you a little bit more about the revegetation efforts as well as public access.
Great. Thank you very much, Katrina. Greatly appreciate that discussion of the restoration project. As Katrina said, I'll touch on a few additional aspects of the potential benefits of the restoration project. And as mentioned on the previous slide, I'll start with revegetation in a bit more detail as Katrina described. And again, what we're looking at here is essentially, again, another before and after of the existing conditions of the site versus the conditions with the proposed project. And we wanted to highlight here the anticipated increase in riparian habitat, which again is native vegetation along the river that would be associated with the project as depicted here in these images. Again, as Katrina mentioned, a key goal will be to try to avoid and preserve as much of the existing riparian vegetation, including cottonwoods, as we can and to the greatest extent feasible. Some of the existing trees, obviously within the restoration area, will need to be replaced after construction is complete. But any trees that do inevitably need to be removed can potentially be utilized to create habitat features within the channel and banks of the restored river. The process will overall, therefore, then strive to balance the existing trees, preservation of existing trees, with the desired future conditions for the river and the overall ecosystem functionality of the river corridor. Generating these models, we essentially modeled where the different riparian habitat zones are anticipated to develop over time, based upon, again, the proposed grading and recontouring of the river channel that Katrina just described. Our approach to the vegetation itself will be to allow for both natural recruitment of native riparian species along the river corridor, as well as active planting to try to jumpstart that vegetation and restoration process. This active planting effort is anticipated to require up to a few years of a temporary irrigation system that would be installed on the site during the plant establishment period, which again is usually about 2 to 3 years. And the reason for that being obviously that young plants that are initially put on the ground, they don't have fully developed root systems that are acclimatized to the site conditions. And they also obviously wouldn't be able to necessarily reach those groundwater tables that we're trying to target yet. So we find that a little bit of supplemental water in the first stages goes a long way towards success of the riparian restoration. On the next slide here, I'll just show, again, these are just some representative images of the potential plant palette that we are looking to potentially install with that active planting along the river corridor. We do want to note that this process is ongoing of selecting the plant species that we would plan to use, and that it has included and will continue to include outreach and consultation with local Native American tribes in order to target species that are of cultural importance and significance in the area. So just a few of these representative species, again, some of these riverside and floodplain plants may include some of the species that are shown on the top row, which would include bulrush, sedges, and horsetail, for example, growing in the newly created floodplain areas. Some of the larger riparian plant canopy may include species such as the bottom row, such as willow, dogwoods, and obviously replacing those emblematic black cottonwoods. So that's a brief overview of the revegetation. And then again, to close, we'll just talk a little bit more in depth about the public access considerations. We obviously want to address directly your continued interest in the public access at the site. And obviously the relationship, many of you are likely here this evening to hear about the relationship of the restoration project to those proposed public access elements. So this image, many of you may recognize, is from the general development plan that was recently completed by the Parks District with input by many of you. And we'll highlight just a few of those proposed uses again, that again, we believe our project will be consistent with and potentially enhance. So some of those projects include the yellow boundary at the northern top of the site was designated as a potential trailhead and dog park location, which we appreciate is obviously the dog park itself is in the advanced stages of planning, design, and funding. So we will therefore be working to ensure that our project does not delay implementation of the dog park or result in any changes to the size and overall planned uses within that park. Other uses that were identified that will be preserved by our project as well include the planned CAL FIRE staging area, which is outlined here in red, as well as Katrina mentioned, this dashed line here represents that general location of the wildlife corridor on the east side of the park. And again, as Katrina said, our project we anticipate will further enhance that functionality, whereas that is a north-south connection. Our project and the river itself would then create an east-west connection as well. So enhancing that connectivity for wildlife all across the site. A few others that we'll mention, again, all of these white lines that are shown here in varying widths throughout the park, that was the conceptual circulation pattern for trails along the site. There are obviously many existing cart paths along the former golf course that could potentially utilize those same alignments. But again, our effort will be to be consistent with the overall plan of the general development plan, in that we will be creating both shorter loop trails that navigate and allow users to experience, the public to experience the Rancho Cañada unit itself, as well as preserving connections to more distant destinations within the Palo Corona Park. In addition, we also wanted to mention and to clarify that ongoing public access will be provided during construction of the project. And we will make every effort to preserve as much use as we can during that time frame. There may potentially be some limitations due to obvious safety considerations associated with construction, but the plan would be to keep the park open to the maximum extent possible. And finally, as Katrina mentioned, given that the project will excavate and remove a significant amount of soil along the river, we will be attempting to reuse this material on site to further enhance the park experience and to limit the overall environmental impacts that could be associated with attempting to move that soil to any other location. And finally, before we wrap up, we just wanted to share again a few more representative images of these potential public access improvements. Again, emphasizing one more time that the restoration project is anticipated to be compatible with all of the key public access elements of the GDP. So in the upper images, we see some more of those planned uses from the general development plan, which would include picnic areas, nature play opportunities, and outdoor classrooms distributed across the site. And then on the lower row, we wanted to share just a few of the additional potential enhancements that may now be possible due to the recontouring of the site associated with the restoration project. So those could potentially include amenities such as additional opportunities for amphitheaters based upon the landforms that we'll be creating in the upland areas of the site, opportunities for technical running courses on some portion of the site, and obviously ample opportunities for wildlife viewing across the newly restored river corridor as well. So with that, that concludes our presentation. And again, I'll just reiterate on behalf of all of our speakers, we greatly appreciate your attendance tonight and your interest in the project. And now we appreciate your patience and interest in the presentation, and I'll hand it over to our lead facilitator, Meg Perry, who will guide us through the question and answer process.
Great, thank you, Mark. And thanks again to all of our presenters for helping to provide a bit more clarity on what's envisioned for this project. As Mark mentioned, I'm Meg Perry with SWCA, and I'll walk us through this question and answer portion of our meeting. We're so glad to have you all with us this evening. A little over 30 people on the line here. So we'll get right into it. Just a couple of reminders as you prepare to share any questions or comments about how to do that. You can click the raise hand button in Zoom to indicate that you have a question or comment you'd like to share. If you're joining us by phone only, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 on your phone. So that's an option. And as at least a few people have already discovered, you have a Q&A button in Zoom where you can type in a question if you prefer to share something that way. And we'll just take questions and comments in the order they come. And I'm sure this goes without saying, but please try to keep questions and comments concise, since we do have quite a number of folks on the line. And of course, respectful and directed to our panelists rather than one another. We never know with Zoom what little ears might also be listening in the room. So thanks for being attentive to your language. Great, with that, I will turn it to a couple of hands and questions we've already received, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name, please correct me. So I will turn it to David Malali, and I'll invite you to unmute.
Hi, Meg. Dave Malali here. I'm pushing the buttons. Hopefully I'm coming through.
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate your group. It's an incredible project. We followed the Carmel River Free project with excitement, and now to have one similar closer to home. We are residents at Hacienda Carmel, and to be able to watch this evolve over the next number of years is very exciting. I would like to mention that Katrina and I had a chance to speak earlier today. I'm one of the 4 members of what's been called the Dog Park 4. We're the ones that initiated and have shepherded along the dog park at the Rancho Park. And that project is in process. We're hoping to get funding maybe this year and maybe start construction this year or next spring, which I understand will be ahead of your project, unfortunately, but we definitely support your project. And if our project is delayed or deferred later because of funding issues, and you do have soil and riprap and that available, I'm sure we can work with you in configuring the dog park to utilize some of that and to make the dog park experience more interesting. But the main thing is we do not want to be delayed in the dog park or have the dog park any smaller. And I know that was acknowledged in the beginning, and we really do thank you for that.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I'll turn us next to Norman Leave. Go ahead and unmute.
Mute button, fine. Norman Levy, thank you. Dave covered a lot of what I had in mind. I'm also a member of the Dog Park 4. I think Dave had mentioned in an email to me that perhaps some of that earth could be used for berming, berming throughout the dog park. One of our primary concerns in the dog park is the vegetation that is currently there is pretty much all we're going to have. So we're very concerned about equipment rolling over it, very concerned about whether or not they're planning on spreading additional earth over it. Do you know whether or not the existing vegetation that's there will be preserved? And also, do you have any start and finish dates in mind for the project that you're contemplating here, which we are very much in favor of?
I can take a shot at that if that's okay, Meg.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, yeah, Norman and David, thank you guys very much. It was great talking with you this morning, David. In terms of our timeline, I think that's a question that's also in the chat Q&A. Tom can chime in with this a little bit more, but the earliest that we anticipate potentially going to construction would be the summer of 2024. We do anticipate it will take a few years to get through construction of this project, probably 2 construction seasons, 2024 and 2025. That would be the earliest. Again, we have not yet started applying for funding, and so it will be very funding dependent. So I think that might answer your timeline question. And then again, I think as both Norman and David, both you mentioned, I think we're very willing to work with you to avoid having any soil on the dog park or potentially to create berms and more complexity in the dog park if that's something that works out for the respective project timelines. And then finally, related to vegetation in the dog park, again, if we're not putting any soil there, then we would not be disturbing any of the existing vegetation that is there. I do know that closer to the river, we do anticipate doing some revegetation and some planting, so that would increase the seed bank and vegetation, but that's going to be focused near the river.
Okay, well, thank you. If Raphael could answer a question, Raphael, do you see anything that would inhibit us from moving forward more or less on the time schedule that David outlined earlier this evening?
Good morning, or good evening, Norman. No, I do not see that there's anything that would hinder or slow down the process. Certainly right now we have applied for a grant. If we receive that grant, we will move and execute that grant immediately. We certainly don't want to compromise the timeframe that that grant would establish needing expenditure. So no, we'll move forward with the dog park.
Terrific. Thrilled to hear that.
Great, thank you. Tom, did you have something to add as well?
Yeah, there was a question about time frame and then also funding, and I just wanted to mention that we're funding the, I'm with an agency that does deal with funding mostly. So we have used, there's a special fund for the Carmel River every year that the river, the water supply is they're called overdraft, taking a little more or a lot more than is legally allowed. Some money goes into a special fund to help offset the impact of that, and the Coastal Conservancy manages that fund. We've used that fund to pay for what you're seeing tonight. There's a couple things going on. Cal-Am is now on track to not take more than their allotted amount, so there won't be more money going into that fund. And the fund is also not large enough to pay for construction of a project like this. So we have the funding to complete the design, apply for permits, and start looking for money. But we'll be looking for federal and state grants to fund the construction. As far as the costs, that's something in the chat from Michael Waxer. Hello, Michael. It's a moving target right now. We should have a better idea in a few months. One of the biggest costs, of course, is the green and dark green, light green and dark green, and then the brown, which is all the dirt that needs to be moved. And we're still playing around with elevations. We're driving Katrina and her team crazy because we keep changing our mind. Say, well, what if we do 2 inches higher, 2 inches lower? So when we get a solid idea of how much soil needs to be moved, we'll have a much better idea of the cost. But it's going to be, it's going to be in the millions. So that's all I can tell you tonight.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a few other questions in Q&A, and I'll just continue encouraging folks to raise your hand or put questions in Q&A, and we'll kind of get to you in the order your questions are coming in. So Robin Andrew asked, where does the water in Carmel River come from, and is the drought going to impact the water levels?
I can take a shot at that, but maybe Tom or Tim or anyone else can chime in with this as well. So the water in the Carmel River comes from its watershed. So it comes from the surrounding mountains and all of the various tributaries and creeks that bring it down into the river. And the drought does impact water levels. The drought impacts water across the state, both groundwater levels and surface water levels. So with less rain, we would expect less runoff into the creek and therefore lower flows in the Carmel River.
Great, anything to add from others? Okay, good, thanks for that question. Nicole Nedeff asked, could Katrina elaborate on how the Rancho Cañada restoration will meld into the work proposed downstream in the Cañada Village development?
So I'll again invite maybe Tom to help me answer this question. Currently, as the consultant to the State Coastal Conservancy working on the design of this project, we're moving forward with the design only on the current Rancho Cañada unit. So that's the area that's outlined in yellow on this figure here. However, as I think Nicole may be referring to, There is potential for an expansion in the future, depending on what happens with the Rancho Canada Village development. And we did consider that at the very early conceptual design stage in terms of how these two areas could potentially interact. So I do not think that our current project excludes any additional work downstream.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's not our property. The developers of that project are moving forward, and you know, there's a significant amount of riverfront land there that will be preserved for similar uses and ecological, you know, endpoints. But we're not connected to that project in a solid way. We want to work together, but we're on separate timeframes, and everything else is separate. We're talking to that project periodically and talking about how we can help each other out.
Great, thank you. Okay, one more question in the Q&A, and then I'll turn to Garrett Taylor, whose hand is up. So Elizabeth Matz asked, what kind of permits are required for this project? When do you anticipate applying for permits, and are you required to go through CEQA?
Hi. Tom, I can go ahead and answer that if you want.
Please, yes. Please.
So I'm Lauren Huff. I'm with SWCA also. I've been listening in, and I'm here to field some questions. I'm a permitting specialist with SWCA and the project manager on the SWCA side of things. So permits required for the project, we will be anticipating applying for Regional Board, Army Corps, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife permits. And we have started coordinating with the agencies already. We will not be applying for the permits until we get to 65% design. And then at that point, we will start applying for permits and coordinating more closely with the resource agencies. And this project will require a CEQA review. However, there are new mechanisms for restoration projects and CEQA, and we're looking into those. So the actual CEQA process and strategy has not been finalized at this point. And Tom, if you have anything else to add, feel free.
There's also county grading permit.
Thank you.
We have talked to the county planning department early on to get a better idea of the process. You know, that's kind of it. You know, as Lauren mentioned, there's actually quite a bit of things going on statewide. Hopefully streamline the permitting process for restoration projects. We may fall under some of those things, or we may just be too big, or we may decide that, you know, everybody loves our project anyway, so let's just get regular permits. So we'll see.
Great, thanks, Lauren and Tom. Okay, Garrett Taylor, you should be able to unmute.
Hello, hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, this project is really cool, and I'm excited about that area being restored back to natural habitat or whatever you guys do with that. This is awesome. So anyways, I'm familiar with the property owners on the very bottom of this picture here, specifically that lower floodplain pasture that you see. If you move the cursor lower, and then right about there, if you were to move it. Yeah, so that area. In one of, and I think it was Christina's slides, she was showing in the future that might be a portion of floodplain. And my question is that eventually going to be like annually once a year covered in water, or will it just be wet, or what will the effect on that pasture be?
Yeah, that's a good question, Garrett. So, so we are not anticipating doing any construction on that property.
Oh, we're just getting some echo. I'm gonna mute you, Garrett.
Okay, sorry about that. We're not anticipating doing any construction on that property or turning that property into floodplain habitat. I think what you may have been referring to is the slide where we were showing our 100-year flood inundation. And so at that extremely high level of flood, which again has never actually occurred, it's more of a theoretical exercise that we use to evaluate flood impacts. At that extremely high level, both under existing conditions and in the future with the project, there would be some water that would be ponded on that field. So whether that would actually occur in any of our lifetimes is highly unknown. And so yeah, it's not part of the floodplain areas that are for this project. This project, as I mentioned, would potentially be reducing the flood levels upstream. So we do not anticipate any worse inundation on that property with the project than it would be now. But based on at least the hydraulic modeling that we've done at an extremely high, again, potentially completely unrealistic flood flow, there would potentially be some water that backs up onto that field. Is that the slide that you were looking at when you were thinking about that, Garrett?
I want to say yes. It was the one where it had two slides, one on top of the other, same photo. The bottom one showed a slightly larger blue area, and there's like a dark blue area that you were referring to during that one. Okay,
yeah, that's the 100-year flood.
Okay, so that's just levels. If levels just became outrageous.
Correct. So that property would not inundate.
Okay, cool.
Until,
thank you.
Yeah, extremely high flows. It doesn't inundate at a 10-year flow, or it's only once we get into extremely high events that that it starts being inundated.
And I'll just add that the construction, you can kind of see in this image, there's the South Bank Trail in white, and then it runs along and gets obscured by the yellow line down at the very bottom of the figure. That South Bank Trail, further down at the very bottom there, that South Bank Trail kind of runs along the pasture there. And it's even below that, I think. Yeah, down there. That trail went in while there was still a golf course there. It is a very popular trail. I think a side project, I'm not taking on another element right now, but it would be nice to kind of move that trail into our project and have a more interesting trail that runs along the edge of our new floodplain. So just another thing to think about, that our construction project happens well north of that South Bank Trail.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that would be a cool trail to have going through the actual park when you have it back to the habitat that you're restoring it to. So right. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for your question. All right, I'm not seeing other hands up or questions in our Q&A at the moment, and we are at the top of the hour, but our team is game to stick around if there are any other remaining questions or comments. So I'll give it just another little few seconds here if there's anyone else with a lingering curiosity or comment to share for the team's consideration.
Well, the other thing I wanted to mention, I think maybe you did already and I wasn't paying attention, but this is recorded and we're going to make this available. So tell your friends and people who missed it, they want to hear more about this project, we'll have that recording. And I would assume I can put a link on our website to that.
Yep, that'll be up on the web, and I just put the project website in the chat. So folks can click on that to go to the project website and see where you can find the recording after this. So with that, thank you everyone once again for your attention, for your interest in this project, and thanks again to our presenters.
I think we have some more hands.
Oh, you're right. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go to Luis Miranda Ramirez and then David.
Thank you. I've listened, and I think about what's sort of sad to me is when people question CEQA. First of all, let me say I am Louise Miranda Ramirez. I am the tribal chairwoman for Ohlone, Costanoa, and Estland Nation. And what people seem to ignore is that always along waterways our people lived. And our ancestors left artifacts, left a way of life for us to know about. And before any project comes in and changes or destroys, or we should have the right to be there to learn, to make sure that these things are not destroyed. And it's really hurtful when people say, oh, God, is CEQA going to be involved? You know, we are trying to work with you and to come to an understanding. And when people understand that, eventually maybe things will go easier, but that doesn't always happen. And so I just want to say, you know, CEQA is not bad. And when people ask about it, I wish they'd understand it a little bit more before there's any question about it. So thank you for bringing this information. And hopefully we'll talk more later. Thank you.
Louise, I would just like to second that. Our group is, SWCA is responsible for both CEQA and cultural resources, and including tribal outreach, which is going to be a very important part of this project. The preliminary concepts that we've come to right now, this is the reason for this meeting, to gauge interest, and we'll definitely be reaching out to everybody who's a stakeholder to get the input necessary to make the most conscious decisions about how we introduce things like tribally indigenous plants that might have been destroyed during former golf course development and that kind of thing, so that this is also a very culturally rich and historically relevant project.
And I just wanted to add that any of the mechanisms that we do go through for CEQA through some of these restoration project streamlining will still require the outreach. So that piece will not be missing from the process.
Right. I think that the mechanisms we were talking about streamlining, you know, we always are kind of like, oh, CEQA, because it's a changing thing in the restoration realm right now. There's a lot of initiatives to streamline, but it's only because it's a restoration project as opposed to a development project. We still have to answer all the same CEQA checklist questions and evaluate all the necessary checklist items.
Yep, and appreciate the reminder of the historic significance of these river sites and the fact that there are going to be cultural artifacts and cultural significance likely in these areas. So thank you. All right, David Mullally.
Thank you. On the slide that I'm looking at in the lower right corner, the yellow line takes an abrupt angle and then a right turn back down, and apparently excludes part of the river in that area. I was always under the impression that was part of the park's property. Is it not?
No, it's not part of the park's property. So Raphael, you can add there, but yeah, there is that little cutout, and it's not part of the park's current property. So that's why there's no construction planned for that area.
That's correct, Katrina.
Okay, thank you.
And we had a clarification from the previous question about CEQA, noting that that wasn't intending to imply that CEQA was a detriment to the project, just wondering about the timeline. So thanks for that. And then a question from Kay Armstrong, who asked, will project design and further development include opportunities for the public to stay aware of how plans and funding are progressing?
Yes, I'll take that. This is a public project on public land, so yes, this is going to be fully transparent. We're not only going to have items placed on our website, but most likely on the state coastal conservancies and other websites as well. And we will work with the local press to release press releases as appropriate and as the public requests. Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, other questions or comments? Okay. Well, you do have that project website there as a reference going forward. And as just mentioned, there will be continued opportunities to keep track of this project and how it's progressing through the website, and probably similar avenues to wherever you heard about this meeting today. So once again, thank you so much for attending, for your attention and your interest in the project. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.